On the 25th of June 1876, along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana, 5 of the 7th Cavalry's 12 companies were annihilated by 2,000 warriors of the Lakota Sioux. The total US casualty count included 268 dead and 55 severely wounded, 6 of whom later died from their wounds. Remembered by the Plains Indians as the Battle of Greasy Grass, it remains one of the worst disasters in US military history. Afterwards, the body of its commander, George Armstrong Custer, shot in the chest and head, was found surrounded by the corpses of 42 of his troopers and 39 of the slain horses. The initial reaction to the massacre from those in authority was deeply critical, especially as it occurred during the Great Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, celebrating 100 years since the founding of the Republic. The surviving commanders were put on trial, and many in the press, the army and the government saw the attack as an incompetent fiasco. However, ironically, the one person who would emerge in a positive light from the debacle of the Little Bighorn was Custer himself. His famous last stand would become the subject of hundreds of books, songs, poems and Hollywood movies, which painted Custer as an American hero, the epitome of the frontier spirit, whose personal sacrifice was building the new nation.
Maybe you were right. About glory.
So why did the actions of this ambitious, glory-seeking incompetent, who presided over this squalid military failure, become the stuff of American legend? The answer lies with the story of the woman who made the legend, the remarkable figure of his wife, Libbie Custer. Elizabeth Libbie Custer was born in Monroe, Michigan in 1842, the daughter of a wealthy judge and politician. Beautiful and intelligent, she met Custer in 1862 when he was on leave from the Union Army. She immediately fell in love with the dashing young cavalry officer, although it would be a further 2 years before her father allowed them to be married. After the Civil War, Libby became a devoted army wife, dutifully following her husband out west to a variety of frontier army posts, the last of which was the fateful posting to the Dakota Territory in 1873. Libby was devastated by her husband's death. Along with her husband, 2 of his brothers, a nephew and her own brother James Calhoun, had also perished. Isolated and impoverished, with only an inadequate widow's pension, she was also burdened with Custer's substantial debts. Along with this, it appeared that her husband's reputation was also about to be ruined, especially when President Ulysses S. Grant publicly came out and blamed Custer personally for the disaster, telling the press that he considered the whole massacre as a sacrifice of troops brought on by Custer himself that was wholly unnecessary. Grant had never liked Custer, suspecting that the ambitious cavalry officer, as a Democrat, harboured political ambitions and openly supported the president's political enemies. It was Grant's intervention in particular that mobilised Libby on her husband's defence. The dramatic story of the Little Bighorn electrified the country, and within months an opportunistic journalist, Frederick Whitaker, rushed out an adoring biography of Custer after speaking to Libby. This interaction encouraged her further to increase her own efforts to vindicate her husband. Showing great energy, she began to write articles and engage in speaking tours in a remarkably successful one-woman campaign to rehabilitate his image in the popular imagination. She never remarried and remained utterly devoted to her husband's legacy. Throughout her long widowhood, Libbie Custer would trumpet her husband's achievements and sacrifice, transforming him from what he was, an arrogant, bumbling incompetent, into a patriotic, heroic martyr. Soon after the battle, she moved to New York, where she wrote 3 books about her and her husband's life on the frontier. Her first, Boots and Saddles, published in 1885, described her life in Dakota from 1873 to 1876, and compellingly presents the shared anxiety of wives left at Fort Lincoln while their husbands fought and died at Little Bighorn. She followed this up with 2 others. In Tenting on the Plains, General Custer in Kansas and Texas, 1887, she describes her colourful experiences in Kansas and Texas after the Civil War. In 1890, Libby published her last book, Following the Guidon, in which she picks up the story after her husband returned to duty in Kansas in 1868 to join the campaign which ended in the so-called Battle of Washita River. In reality, it was far from a battle. Instead, it was a squalid massacre of innocent men, women and children. She vividly recalls her meetings with captured Native Americans and attendance at tribal peace councils while praising her husband's honest treatment of those he helped defeat. These books were masterpieces of subtle propaganda and very influential on later writers. In all her work, she portrayed her husband as an exemplary son, brother, husband, and conscientious commanding officer. So powerful did her voice become that Libby, a ubiquitous presence at national commemorations, both shaped and policed the historical narrative. Since the army and the public saw Libby as a model wife and a devoted military widow, many Custer critics withheld their comments during her lifetime. The fact that she outlived almost all of the survivors of the battle meant that few veterans of the campaign were prepared to go public with their stories, many of which were heavily critical of the vainglorious Custer. Without these contrary accounts, Custerology became the focus of amateur enthusiasts who concentrated almost exclusively on reconstructing the events of the battle with little regard for the broader context. Libby's story was especially powerful in this regard. She told a sanitized story of the West and life on the heroic frontier, which made her very popular with politicians in an early and powerful manifestation of American nationalism. Both Walt Whitman and Longfellow lionized Custer in their poems, but it was the visual arts that proved most powerful in selling the legend. In 1895, the brewing company Anheuser-Busch commissioned Otto Becker to produce a lithograph of Cassidy Adams' painting Custer's Last Fight, and then proceeded to distribute the print to tens of thousands of saloons across America, who would proudly display this iconic image behind the bar for decades to come. No performance of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was complete without a performance of Custer's Last Rally as its closing act for periods in the 1880s and 1890s. Hollywood movies soon followed. In 1926, the silent film General Custer at the Little Bighorn opened in movie theaters in the US, to be followed by a romanticized biopic of Custer, They Died with Their Boots On, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland as Libby. Released in 1941, the myth of Custer was resurrected to bolster American patriotism at a crucial time in the nation's history. Libby herself had died in New York City 8 years earlier, 4 days before her 91st birthday, on the 4th of April 1933. As per her request, she was buried next to her husband at West Point. A few years before her death, she told a writer that her greatest disappointment was that she never had a son to bear her husband's honoured name. Her death gradually released the stranglehold she had on her husband's memory, and within a year of her death, Frederick van der Vorta published the first critical biography of Custer entitled The Glory Hunter. Other historians began to collect the till then silenced memories of other participants, including those of Native Americans, and from then the slow reappraisal of Custer's character and career began. Today, while historians still argue over the details of what happened, it was clear that the Battle of the Little Bighorn was a military disaster of Custer's own making. However, like so many glorious failures in history, the Alamo, the Charge of the Light Brigade, or the Easter Rising of 1916, the details are less important than the myths they come to convey. And for good or ill, the actions and ideologies they inspired in the minds of future generations. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you again next time.